How's everybody this morning? Thank you for coming. My name is Paul Austin. Lisa and I have the privilege of working here every day. I'm going to deliver your safety message for the day. In this building, there are a number of exits. There's one right there. If we need to go out, be careful. That one is slippery once you go out the door. You can go out the door you came in, and there's a parallel exit on the far side. There's also the stairs up above. If we need to shelter in place, we'll shelter here. If we need to evacuate, we'll meet over at the corner on Arundel and Concordia and at the stop sign so we can take roll and figure out who's there. And if it gets really, really bad, I have a special key to a little closet in the other room. That's the safest place in the building, so follow me on the way through. One other safety message as you leave: do not turn left on Concordia. We watch people leave our parking lot every single day and turn left, and we always cringe. And we've been lucky there's never been a crash there, but just pay attention to that when you come through. Obviously, we've got a full house today. The restrooms are out here. There's refreshments out here. Please make yourself at home. We are very glad you're here. This is a very timely topic for us. And to kick us off, I get to introduce a friend and colleague, Colonel Matt Langer. You bet.
Thanks, everybody. It's great to have about 63 people here, maybe, and about 63 or so online as well. So huge turnout. It's always good to be amongst friends from all the different industries, all the different places where you work, where you do your thing, but all related to traffic safety. So it's really good to be here. It is an important topic. It's a timely topic for a bunch of different reasons. But today's topic, of course, is drugs, drivers, and damage on our roads. This morning's presentation will highlight the need for action now to reverse this trend and keep drug driving from moving beyond our grasp. You'll hear about an increase in incidents of drug driving in Minnesota and throughout the U.S., what law enforcement and prosecutors are doing to combat the issue, and the challenges in arresting and charging these extremely dangerous drivers, because those of us in the law enforcement arena know that charging and building a case against a drugged driver is slightly more difficult and challenging than an impaired driver who's impaired by alcohol, because that's sort of viewed as normal. And I kind of kick this discussion off, as I do every time, in the front of the DRE academies or the DRE classes, the drug recognition experts. I talk about, in my career when I started, and I don't know what vintage everyone is here, but I started in 1999, which in some ways feels like a super long time ago for some people, but not that long ago for others. But when I started, we were trained on alcohol, 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 alcohol. It was almost all how to find an alcohol impaired driver. And then a little bit at the end, really good training, but a little bit at the end about, well, what if they're impaired, but they blow zeros on the PBT? Now what do we do? And that's really the way that I remember that training, and I remember it being really well. And if you fast forward to today, when I talk to some of our districts, particularly in northern Minnesota, they're seeing well over half of their impaired driving arrests are actually drugs and not alcohol. So the way that we're training and preparing today's law enforcement officers and those that are involved with this problem is different than we did 20 some years ago, where it was all alcohol and a little bit of drugs. Now it's just impairment, whether it's drugs or alcohol, with special consideration for looking out for those impaired drivers that are impaired by drugs. So this class is going to highlight some really important topics that are critical for us right now as we deal with drugged drivers on the road that are using all kinds of different substances, most of the time several different substances, not just one. And then as Don and I were talking, we have to remember alcohol is a drug too. So we kind of talk about alcohol impaired driving and then drug impaired driving, but they're both drugs because they impair you. So a lot of great topics to talk about here. Before I introduce our speaker, Lieutenant Morose, I want to pass the microphone so everyone gets a sense of who's in the room, and whether you're here in the room or whether you're online. So I should have probably said this, but most of you know me. I'm Matt Langer. I have the honor and privilege of serving as the chief of the State Patrol and leading the Minnesota State Patrol with a bunch of passionate folks at the Department of Public Safety on this topic and others. So Lisa, do we want to start with you? I caught you off guard.
Yeah. Lisa Kahns, Minnesota Safety Council and the Network of Employers for Traffic Safety.
I'm Kristen Oster with the Office of Traffic Safety.
Joe Gustafson, traffic engineer for Washington County Public Works.
Curtis Craig, Human First at the U.
Caitlin Schwieters, Human First at the U.
I'm Chris Ballard from the Minnesota Department of Health.
Nicole Morris, University of Minnesota, Human First. Katie Knudsen, Legislative Director, Department of Public Safety.
Bill Schaefer, Office of Traffic Safety.
Nancy Johnson, Minnesotans for Safe Driving.
Jane Landwehr, Office of Traffic Safety.
Irene Jones, Office of Traffic Safety.
Dave Boxham, Office of Communications, Department of Public Safety.
Tim Harlow with the Star Tribune.
Holly Kostreski, Northeast Minnesota Towards Zero Death Regional Coordinator.
Good morning. Mike Hanson with the Office of Traffic Safety.
Tom Nixon, East Central TZD.
Pat Morris, Instructor, EMS.
Christine Hernandez, State TZD.
Sue Johnson, Northwest Region TZD.
Tara Helm, Metro Region Towards Zero Death Program Coordinator.
JP Galach, Mndot Communications.
Matthew Marin with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration.
Shawnette Doggett with Regions Hospital and Ramsey County TZD.
Sheila Nesbitt, North Memorial Hospital.
Steve Brotzer, Traffic Safety by Design.
Tom Burrs, St. Paul Schools Transportation Director.
Joni Soames, Emergency Nurses Association and Dakota County TZD.
Dan Dirksen, Bloomington PD.
Dan Merseth, Bloomington PD.
Mike Gallagher, Bloomington PD.
Craig Flynn, Office of Traffic Safety.
Brian Sorensen, State Traffic Engineer with Mndot.
Tommy Elbendia, Mendota Heights PD.
Wayne Wegener, Mndot Heights PD.
Travis Hale, Blaine PD.
Mark Kindy, Minnesota Department of Health.
Stephanie Malinup, the Center for Transportation Studies at the University of Minnesota. Melissa Jelly, Southwest TZD.
Gordy Pearson, Office of Traffic Safety.
Susan Robinson, Safe Communities of Wright County. Sheila Denton, Child Passenger Safety, Southern Minnesota Liaison. Chelsea Palmetier, Office of Traffic Safety.
Jessica Schleck, Southeast TZD.
Lauren Hill, Mndot State Aid.
Ian Sari, Mndot Office of Traffic Engineering.
Leslie Seymour, Minnesota Department of Health.
Nancy Frank Wilson, Hennepin County TZD. Karen Spratler, Kimley Horn.
Jason Bartell, State Patrol.
Tom Lowry, Eden Prairie.
Mark Hodowanek, Highway Federal Credit Union.
David Sheen, Hennepin County Public Works.
Derek Lure, Mndot Office of Traffic Engineering.
Monica Jensen with the Dakota County Attorney's Office and Towards Zero Death Coalition.
Linda Dolan, University of Minnesota Center for Transportation Studies.
Tim Parkos, Washington County Work Zones.
Scott Edgeworth, TZD Metro. Scott McConkey, Law Enforcement Liaison, Southern Minnesota. Bill Hamas, Metro Law Enforcement Liaison from the Office of Traffic Safety.
Frank Scherf, Northeast Law Enforcement Liaison, and I have the pleasure of working with my grandfather, Bill.
Becky Putsky, I'm Northwest Law Enforcement Liaison, Office of Traffic Safety.
Wait, introduce yourself.
Mark Peterson, AAA.
Courtney Howard, AAA. Adam Bald, Risk Management for the State of Minnesota.
Meredith Terpstra, the other AAA.
Awesome. And we have about 60 people online. So I'll just pass the microphone one more time. If we could each share our most embarrassing moment. We'll stay here till noon and pretend we're here till 4 and go home. Sound like a deal? No. Great group of people. When I hear and see the faces and hear where you're from and your expertise, I feel like we can conquer the world when it comes to traffic safety, which is a great collaborative energy here. So I've got the privilege of introducing our speaker, Lieutenant Don Morose. I'm not going to read his bio because I think I can do it better without reading his bio. But Don started with the State Patrol in 1988. He got involved with DRE soon after he started in about 1991, kind of right at the beginning of the whole DRE thing in the United States, and got involved with that and has been involved with it deeply ever since. He worked dog watch for many years, had a passion for arresting impaired drivers, has a passion for teaching has gotten involved in a lot of different things and has been a DRE coordinator for our state for several years. For us, he did a little time, so to speak, at Capital Security, and then also part of our training division now at overseeing the DRE program. He's a Kathy Swanson Award winner at TZD this year. He's been around the country talking about drug driving and drug impairment and impaired driving and DRE and standardized field sobriety testing protocols, and really one of the hidden gems, I think, in Minnesota in terms of an expert, a true expert that's recognized nationally on the topic of drug impaired driving. I'll keep going, but he's already sick of hearing about himself, and he wants the microphone to talk about this topic, which is critical. So please let me welcome Lieutenant Morose to lead us through this.
Thank you so much. I fear he may have oversold me a bit, but we'll see what we can do to live up to that introduction. So, as the Colonel said, I'm Don Morose. I've spent a number of years doing DWI either on the enforcement side or on the training side, and have a passion for it, and hopefully we can get that across. Everybody in here I know has a passion for it, but hopefully we can maybe increase that a little bit today. I'm going to come from the enforcement perspective because that's what I do. I know a lot of you, or many of you, aren't on the enforcement side, but just recognizing what we do certainly helps you maybe get closer to what you do and make the connections you need to make to increase our awareness and our enforcement of drug impaired driving. I always like to say I don't want to be a resource for the next 45 minutes or whatever they're going to give me here before they throw me out, but I want to be a resource for as long as you need me to be. So my contact information, feel free to reach out if it's a day, a week, months down the road. I used to say year, but I'm getting closer to the end of my career than I am the beginning. So if you try me in a year from now, you probably aren't going to get me at that number. Everybody will, many people will figure out how to track me down if you don't get me at my state patrol phone number and email. But again, I don't want to be a resource just for the next few minutes for as long as you need me to be. So if I say something today that you're kind of wondering about, or anything down the road, feel free to reach out. I'm more than willing to help you. So this actually is from the Star Tribune from just a few weeks ago, talking about the increase in not only just impaired driving just generally here in Minnesota, but attributed a lot of it to the increase in drug impaired driving. You'll see some data here in just a second about how that has increased over the last 20, 30 years here in Minnesota. And some information on the screen here from DOT and DPS as well on that increase in drug impaired driving. I think part of that is not only do we have more people that are driving on stuff other than alcohol or in addition to alcohol, but we have maybe better training, and we will see how that has really driven this. We'll talk a little bit about the training that we do, but we know that those numbers are increasing. The percentage is still where it is, and we look at the numbers that we have, and we like to champion those numbers, and that's great. But we look at the underlying cause of there, and we still know that we have some work to do, and some focus maybe needs to shift a little bit from what we are currently doing, and add some other focus to maybe the drug impaired driving. So this is virtually unreadable here for you, but you at least get the visual of the bar graph. And on the very far left here, in 1990, this is incidence of drug impaired driving on driver's records in Minnesota for that year. So either a conviction for DWI or then an implied consent entry, a license revocation as a drug driving case. So in Minnesota in 1990, there were 5. 5 people were either convicted of DWI, drugs, or had their license revoked for that. So when we talk about incident, it goes on both sides, either the civil or the criminal side. DRE school started in 1991 here, and as the Colonel referenced, I was in the first DRE school here in Minnesota. We were the 14th state to adopt DRE in the country, and I think we have one of the best programs. That's a little self-serving because I run the program, but I think we have one of the best programs, and as Director Hansen from the Office of Traffic Safety mentioned to me last week, and I wasn't aware of this, but we have the most DREs of any of the states in region, NHTSA Region 5, which is where we are kind of housed for nationally. So that makes me feel good. Support from OTS has certainly been great over the last 30 years on this program. But as you see, we started to grow here. The more DREs we got, the more incidents of drug impaired driving started to pick up. In about 95, 96, we started NHTSA's drugs, that impaired driving training for officers who didn't want to go to DRE school, but wanted to get some information on drug impaired driving. So we started to train officers more and more on what to recognize and how to detect those drug impaired drivers. So that increased a big jump through the mid 90s, and then it grows exponentially. Now, when you look at those numbers and you think, okay, out of 25,000 roughly DWIs, we only have, a couple thousand drug impaired drivers. We must not have that big of a problem. Well, that's just drug impaired driving conviction or a drug impaired driving license revocation. That doesn't factor alcohol in, and we know that alcohol is the most common substance that we combine with other things. So this doesn't count the person who's an 08 and also is high on oxycodone or cocaine or methamphetamine, whatever it happens to be. Those convictions all fall under the alcohol side because they were convicted for the alcohol. And I don't want to say that that's easier, and I'm not going to put words in prosecutors' mouths, but generally with the per se level, it's a little easier. We know a little bit more about alcohol, et cetera. So on the prosecution end and on the jury side of it, it's a little easier on the alcohol side to get those convictions. So this is just strictly drug impaired driving. But just as I said, we went from 5 to nearly 2,000. That's a big swing over the last couple of decades here. And the incidents are there, the training is there. We just have to make sure that we get a little bit better on the training, on the prosecution, on the jury side, et cetera. So in the statute, and the way the statute works, and we just closed a very large loophole here a little over a year ago in our DWI law in the language that allows for what we do for drug impaired driving. I kind of took the ones out that had to do with alcohol and left the bolded ones in. I'm going to talk about for drug impaired driving. So we have controlled substance. We have a definition of that I'll get to in a second. Intoxicating substance, which I'll mention as well. And our per se, or what is deemed to be our per se for Schedule 1s and Schedule 2s. I'll talk about that as well. So what is a controlled substance? We have a definition in statute that says if somebody is under the influence of these set things. That is determined by the federal government. Federal drug schedules, we mirror those here in Minnesota. So there are 5 of them. We adopt them into statute, so our statute adopts the federal drug schedules into our language. So if it is not on that list, it doesn't fit the definition of controlled substance. And for many years, we had things that fell through a very large loophole, as I said, that we closed a couple of years ago, that were not by definition controlled, didn't fit the definition of DWI for an impairing substance. So we had tons of people driving under the influence and no way to really prosecute them and no way to get those sanctions or penalties or whatever to go along with that. We also have in our statute that our Board of Pharmacy can regulate those. They can temporarily add things to those schedules. So if we see something here in Minnesota that we're having an issue with that's not on one of the federal drug schedules, our Board of Pharmacy says, okay, we're going to temporarily put it there, and hopefully as the federal government schedules it, it will fall into that definition as well. And then Minnesota rules also talks about schedules. This was the new language that was just added August of 2018, so a little over a year ago. An intoxicating substance, and the definition of that, we have definitions in statute already for drug and chemical, which I'll show you in a second here. So a drug or chemical that impairs the central nervous system, the human, audio, visual, or mental processes. And that's easy for officers to try to determine that through the same steps that we do, the same way that we do a alcohol impaired driving arrest. So really not a whole lot changes, just some of the observations are different. So this is the definition of drug. I'm not going to belabor this for you. You can read it, but it kind of picks up all the medicinal stuff that wasn't a controlled substance. So what we call those legend drugs here in Minnesota. It does exempt out food, so it says other than food, which is fine. And that was an argument that we got a little pushback on. If I drink too much Diet Coke, you're going to arrest me for DWI. To which I said, if you drink enough Diet Coke to be under the influence of something, then you probably should get arrested for DWI. But okay, I get the point. It would take a whole lot of Diet Coke to impair you, but so I get that. So we can exempt food out of there. That's okay. And things that are not approved for human consumption. So that is a lot of the designer drugs and a lot of the stuff that people are making in their bathroom sink, in their kitchen sink, and selling. So a drug, when introduced in the body, has effects similar to Schedule 1, Schedule 2 controlled substances. So chemical, that's definition for chemical out of statute, medicinal or industrial substances, organic or inorganic. So that gets a lot of the novel psychoactive substances, the folks, again, things that people are mixing up in their bathroom sinks as well. So what is our key to some of that successful prosecution of drug impaired driving? The investigative work for officers has to start on the roadside. We have to dig a little deeper into what is causing that impairment. We know that alcohol, I don't want to say it's easy, but it's easier because we've got the years and years of research that goes into that. We have the per se law. We've got mechanical devices, portable breath testers that will tell us what their alcohol concentration is. We don't have a lot of that. We don't have much of that for the drug impaired driving side. So we got to get some good questions, not only at the roadside, but then again, post Miranda, we got to get those questions and get that recorded statement from those individuals about what they used, how much they used, when they used it, how it makes them feel. If it's medicinal stuff, what you take, when you took it, when you're supposed to take it, how much were you supposed to take, how much did you take? So there's a lot of questions that officers need to dig a little deeper when we think that it's a drug impaired driving or it's that in addition to alcohol, starting at the roadside. So for example, for prescribed legal substances, again, some of the things what we want to ask, were you advised that this might affect the way that you're going to drive, operate machinery, whatever it happens to be? A car's a machine, so that falls into that operate machinery. Everybody reads that and says, well, I'm not driving a backhoe anytime soon, so I should be okay to take this and get into my car. Sorry, that also includes a motor vehicle as part of machinery. Was there any warning on your prescription bottle that says don't do this or do that, or it'll cause drowsiness? Those are some of the things that can help bolster a case as well, because it tells us that that individual was instructed, was warned, was advised that there might be some side effects to this that they need to be aware of. Did you know that that medication causes drowsiness or whatever the particular item that we're looking for? And then we would need to document, as an officer, we need to document what those warnings were. If it's an over-the-counter, what are you taking? I took a bunch of cold tablets. What was it? I took Benadryl. Okay. The warning label on the Benadryl, whether it's on the package itself or something that we can find online or whatever, and do a little bit of research to find what those warnings are for that, because that goes into the intoxicating substance piece. There's language in that portion of the statute that says knows or should have known causes that impairment. When that language was proposed for the legislature, a lot of prosecutors thought, boy, we don't want this, because how are we going to prove what people knew, what was in their head? There was some suggestion from some prosecutors that we don't pursue closing that loophole, to which I said we've been fighting that for about 30 years, and I'd rather get close and then maybe have to deal with some of the language than scrap it and wait another 30 years or however long it takes. Boy, if we're this close, we don't want to turn this back away. So really, again, it comes back to the officers. Knows or should have known. Did you know, were you advised that this causes this, does that, and that helps kind of sew up that portion of the statute as well. For illegal substances, if people are willing to talk to us, and it really comes down to our ability to schmooze with these folks and get the information out of them that we would like, why did you take it? And I tell officers all the time, play dumb. I'm a police officer. I've never taken cocaine or I've never smoked synthetic cannabis, so why would you do that? What does it do to you? And if they're willing to tell us, that is great evidence, because they've just told us, oh yeah, it makes me see colors and hear sound, or hear colors and see sounds and all kinds of different things, and it makes me feel like this. That's great. So you smoked that and then you got in your car, you took that and you got in your car. Yeah, I did. Okay. So how does it make you feel? Are you feeling those effects right now? Again, I've never taken any of those substances. I can tell you what other people have told me that it does to them, but that's the key, is getting those individuals to tell us what some of that stuff is. And then from an enforcement standpoint, for the enforcement folks, again, we break our stops down into those 3 phases: stopping the car, going up and spending time at the window, and then doing our field sobriety test. Executive function, that's the part of the brain that deals with a lot of this, deals with that divided attention piece, et cetera. Our ability to plan, you can see the whole list. I won't go through all this, but that is critical when we are driving, and when we add drugs and alcohol into our body, our brain's ability to effectively use our executive function becomes compromised, and we start to lose our ability to do some of these things. And you can see a number of those things on the list are directly related to driving a motor vehicle safely. And here's some more things as far as what executive function does for us. If our brain is compromised, our ability to do those tasks are compromised, we get into a motor vehicle, and certainly we know that the dire consequences of what happens when those things happen. So from a vehicle in motion standpoint, with the officers, we're not going to really see things differently, but think of what those substances might be doing. If I'm sped up, am I driving faster? If I'm slowed down, am I driving slower? Is my depth perception shot? Am I following too closely? Am I having a difficult time keeping my car in my lane of traffic? Am I driving on a completely something that is not the roadway? Those types of things that we see every day with alcohol, but sometimes those things, as we go through our investigation, okay, it makes sense now that they are driving 70 into 30 when I think that they're on a central nervous system stimulant. It makes sense now that they were going 7 miles an hour in a 50 zone because they're on a central nervous system depressant. We can use those things kind of after the fact to make more sense about that arrest and the rest of the observations that we see. Good thing to do, utilize that squad video, kind of play to the camera a little bit for the officers that are in the room and on the webinar here. Get those tests in front of the squad so we can, squad video so we can see those things. Make sure that we get that camera to get that suspect. We get those observations maybe beyond what our field sobriety test does. They're in the back of the car. What are they doing in the back of the car? Keep those, keep that camera, keep that body camera, that squad camera rolling through the entire process, because there's things that might occur, changes in how that person reacts and how their actions are and their emotional states, etc. Also document all those observations as well. Don't necessarily rely on the camera to be there when we need it. Narrate some of those observations as I'm following a car. Yep, they just crossed onto the shoulder. They're going 22 miles an hour in a 50 zone, whatever it happens to be, to help kind of illustrate what's going on, because the camera's good, but it's not perfect. It doesn't pick up everything. So we need to point some of those things out. And obviously watching that video at the end is going to help our recollection when we do prepare for court. So this, when we finally get the car stopped, that's kind of quote unquote the easy part of this whole process. This is the portion, that personal contact, the time spent at the window, discussing with the individual why we've got them stopped and making the observations at the window. Really is a critical piece for law enforcement in the drug to driving cases, because more time spent at the window, making those discussions, asking those questions about their drug and medication use is great stuff. So we don't want to shortcut to this step at all. We don't want to get caught into a what we call cognitive bias. I get an odor of an alcoholic beverage. First thing I think is maybe this is a DWI. I get the driver out. I start to process them for a DWI. If I step up to the window and I smell an odor of burnt marijuana, and I smell an ammonia odor that kind of goes along with methamphetamine, whatever, typically law enforcement officers don't automatically think drug impaired driving. They're thinking, okay, there's drugs in the car. I'm going to get them out to search the car. So we've got to try to change that mentality a little bit and go, hey, how about let's look to see if that driver is impaired. If I want to search the car to see if there's illegal substances in it, a great way to do that would be if I subsequently arrest that driver for DWI, and then I get to search the car. If I take that driver out, I search the car or get permission, or I run a K9 around it, whatever, but then I ultimately search that vehicle, maybe I don't find anything. And a lot of times, like I said, our cognitive bias says, there's no drugs in the car, we're going to send them down the road, and we skip that piece. We forget that piece of the drug impaired driving. So that alcohol generally leads to a DWI investigation. The drug indications typically don't lead to that DWI investigation. We have to kind of change our opinion a little bit on those and our direction on how we're going to do that. So document some things, focus on things that aren't necessarily part of our field sobriety test. We're going to do our field sobriety no different than we would in an alcohol impaired driving case, but look at some of those things that are in addition to those things. What their muscle tone is like, what their pupils are like, are they grinding their teeth, things that they say, are they acting strange, making strange comments, are they using slang? There's been many times as a DRE where I've gone into a case with other officers and I said, tell me what they said. Yeah, they talked about this, this, and this. I'm like, but I didn't know what that meant. Okay, well, this is what that means. Or let's look up what that means, because I'm not sure either. Maybe that will lead us down a path that kind of gives us a little better direction on maybe what this person is using or has used that impaired their ability to drive. So some other things as far as the psychophysical tests go, noticeably slow or fast, how they're doing it, their muscle tone, some general signs during that field sobriety test, and then their ability to process that information. Can they follow those directions? Are they able to complete the tasks we've asked them to do? We talked about that executive function and that it affects divided attention, affects their ability, their short-term memory, and their ability to complete those tasks. So are we seeing things that are specific to some drug-impaired driving versus alcohol? And again, we separate those typically, but again, alcohol is a drug and it's the most common thing that we mix with other things. So we're getting that in addition to some of those other signs and symptoms that we see. Some other things that we focus on more than just our field sobriety tests, they're moving their head during a horizontal gaze nystagmus, their inability to focus their attention on that, repeating instructions, how many times, again, their short-term memory shot. Did they forget count out loud during the walk and turn, during the one-leg stand? Is the second 9 steps on the walk and turn better or worse than the first 9? You think it'd get better, you just practice 9 of them, you got to do 9 more. You think you get a little better on the way back. Sometimes it gets worse because the deeper we get into this, their lack of ability to maintain their attention and focus on the task is starting to wane even more. So from a court standpoint, what we're doing to provide, to prove some of that drug impaired driving stuff for Schedule 1s and Schedule 2, that per se piece, fairly simple. You've got it in your system. There is a built-in defense to that I was given a Schedule II medication by a doctor and that I was using it as the doctor prescribed it. So there is a built-in defense for individuals who have some Schedule II substances in their system. Should have a Schedule I. There is no medical use for any Schedule I drugs in this country. So that's fairly easy to prove. The burden of proof is on the defendant to say, yes, here's the reason I had that Schedule II in my system. But if they have a Schedule I or II prescription, we can still prove the impairment. Many times I've talked to police officers over the years, and they've said, well, they had a prescription. There is no hall pass that the doctor gets to write that says, I'm going to give you this medication, go ahead and drive. Doesn't matter what it does to you, go ahead and drive. There is no free pass. I get it. If a doctor gives me a medication and I take it and impairs my ability to drive, there's the human being part of me says, well, how can we arrest somebody when they were doing what the doctor told them? And the police part of me says, well, because they are a threat to other people on the road. It doesn't matter where that substance came from, whether it's a legit substance, whether it's an over-the-counter, whether it's an illegal substance. If they are driving impaired, we need to address that situation. So even if that person has that prescription for that medication, we still need to be able to prove the impairment. And then for the Schedule 3, 4, and 5 drugs, that's the most difficult to prove. We absolutely need the police officers to document the stuff that I just talked about, get a better questioning at the roadside, get better questioning during the arrest process, because there's no per se level in the statute that just says under the influence of a controlled substance. So many times I equate examples to alcohol so people kind of get it in their brain a little bit. And I tell police officers all the time that drug impaired driving, think of it as an alcohol case where you have a refusal, where you don't have that test value, that number that you can bring into court and say that person tested a 0.15. What does it then hinge on? It hinges on the officer's ability to describe how they drove, how they acted, how they performed on field tests in order to get the conviction in an alcohol refusal case because we don't have the test. Same thing here. We have the substance that showed positive. The presence does not equate to impairment. And I'll come back to that in just a little bit here. Just because it's in their system does not necessarily mean that they were impaired. So again, proving impairment when the presence is not enough. Of the 7 elements that are in the DWI law, so influence of alcohol, influence of a controlled substance, our per se levels for alcohol for driving a motor vehicle or commercial motor vehicle, et cetera, 4 of those require proving impairment beyond a reasonable doubt. So that hinges on the police officer and the observations they make and the evidence that they documented through that arrest process really is the key piece to making sure that the prosecution can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that that person was under the influence. Again, from the drug impaired driving standpoint, particularly because we don't have any per se numbers for any of the drugs other than alcohol. It's the only per se number that we have in statute that says once you hit this level, you're under the influence. And I've looked at that stuff for years, and I've read stuff on that for years as far as per se levels for any of the drugs, and it's probably never going to get there. There may be some that we have some therapeutic, here's a therapeutic dose is in this range, from this range to this range, and that person was double that. Okay, then we can imply that, well, if they were twice what the therapeutic was, they were probably under the influence, but we're never going to get a hard line in the sand for any of the illicit drugs or any of the illicit things for sure. That's my feeling, my opinion, that it's going to, if at all, it's going to be years before we see any number values that go along with any of that stuff. And I know some states have tried to set number values on some substances for their impaired driving, and quite honestly, the research isn't there to back it up. It's almost an arbitrary number that is out there that has been set for those. So again, this comes down to what police officers, what they see, what they smell, what they hear, and how they document that, and then how they can ultimately put it in a report and testify later in court on those things. I had a discussion with a prosecutor a couple of years ago, and they talked about this is called the criminal jury instruction guide. This is what the judge tells the jury that they need to consider in order to convict somebody for DWI. So when we get down to the point that we're at trial, we've gone through the trial, the jury now has the case, and you think to yourself, well, I proved all the elements in the law, so that's what they're going to convict them on. The language, while it is similar, it is a little bit different. It is a little unique for the criminal jury instructions to tell those individuals in order to convict them, it's not drive, operate, physical control, under the influence of alcohol, the stuff that I deal with on the arrest side, it is a little different. So I have tried to stress this to officers. Now think of this when we're out on the roadside. Think of this as we're processing those impaired drivers. Think of what the jury now needs to make sure that we can get those elements into our case. And you can read them up here. I won't read them here for you. Again, that no set standard on any of those drug impaired driving stuff. So we don't have that number. They have to base it on whether that person was in fact under the influence. So again, kind of equate that to a alcohol refusal case. The bottom one here, that person does not possess the clearness of intellect, control, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so I can articulate how they did not perform well on the field sobriety test, but how does that equate to that statement at the bottom here? So that's where we need to make that connection between what we do on the roadside and what the jury needs at the on the other side of the coin, if you want to look at it that way, what they need to think about when they are going to deliberate whether this person is convicted of a DWI or not. So when we do those types of things, what law enforcement officers can do, what prosecutors can do, get some of those buzzwords into the testimony that they lost control. And that plays right into that last statement we talked about, that it was not normal. The things I observed, saw, smelled, and heard are not what I consider normal actions, reactions, whatever it happens to be. Some of the involuntary things that we see. So they are not able to control what their body does. In the driving conduct, the defendant didn't have normal control of the vehicle because they couldn't maintain their lane. They were driving on the shoulder. They were fluctuating their speeds. That is things that we see all the time. But what is that? How does that equate to the jury? That, again, it's not the normal control. They have lost that ability to control that vehicle. As far as their eyes go, that's an involuntary reaction, not normal. If they're bloodshot, if they're dilated, if they're constricted, whatever it happens to be, if their eyelids are droopy, those are all things that they can't control. And those are some of the best signs that we can articulate for our impaired driving cases. The speech, their horizontal gaze nystagmus and vertical nystagmus, those aren't normal things for individuals. And when we see those involuntary reactions, that tells us that that person has lost the ability to control those things. Tests. One of the additional field sobriety tests we do beyond our validated ones is a modified Romberg balance test. Gives us good information what's happening inside that person's body that may not necessarily be manifesting itself on the outside of that person's body. And as a DRE, we will check their pulse, blood pressure, and body temperature and see how that equates. Again, gives us an idea what's going on inside that might not necessarily be going on outside. So utilizing a DRE in your impaired driving cases, obviously near and dear to my heart, been at it for a number of years. I get this question, why? Why do I need a DRE? If I can document the impairment on the roadside and they come back hot for methamphetamine, well, then that's what they're under the influence of, and we'll just get the conviction. And my answer always is, well, what happens if they come back for 2 things or 3 things, or they got a prescription for it? How are you going to be able to articulate the specifics to the observations you saw to the substances that are in their system? Again, presence does not necessarily equate to impairment. So my question is, why not? Why wouldn't you? What does it hurt? Nah, maybe it's going to take a little extra time, but what does it hurt? They are experts. They are experts in the observation of drug impairment and what it does to the body beyond what the normal field officer does. Those officers that are trained in ARIDE can make great observations. We go even deeper than that. So utilize their expertise. The example I use many times is if we all went out to a crash scene where a car went straight off the end of a curve, we would look at it and go, bet he was going too fast. And we'd all go, yeah, probably. Yeah, he was going too fast and couldn't negotiate the curve. Well, how do you know that? What's the evidence that says they were going too fast? You bring in an accident reconstructionist who says, well, the marks on the road said that they were going 50 into a 25-mile-an-hour curve. Yeah, they were going too fast. That is the causal factor. We could stand there all day and argue what the causal factor was. Well, maybe they were on their phone. Yeah, that's true. No, they could have been drunk. Yeah, I guess that's true, or high. Okay, we need to get the evidence, and that's what the DRE is going to do. Warrants are just a process now. So just like the breath test advisory, that is just the vehicle to get the test. That is just the process that we use to get the test. I read the breath test advisory, get a breath test, I get a warrant, and I get a blood or urine test to determine what's inside of them. So utilizing what the DRE says, their opinions, their information, more expertise into that warrant will certainly help convince the presiding judge that, yep, I think we have a good case here, we should get this warrant signed. And then that information obviously transfers to the case on the backside of it as well. Let's provide our best service to our victims. That's what we're here for. We are here to take care of the individuals who are out on the road that maybe get run over by a drunk or high driver. Let's leave no stone unturned. Let's dig as far as we need to dig to make sure that we get the information we get and prosecute the individuals who may have caused that accident, the injuries, the deaths out on our roadways. And unfortunately, that happens that we have to go in there after the fact. We'd like to do it all before the fact and stop them before those things happen. But when it does happen, we need to be able to do the best job that we can do to take care of our victims. It is the investigation of a crime. DWI is a crime, and I know a lot of officers think, yeah, well, it's just traffic. It's not that big a deal. It's not a homicide. It's not an aggravated assault, but it is. It is. Traffic law enforcement is law enforcement. It equates to the same thing. There still is a loss of a family member. Why wouldn't we do the best job that we can do and investigate as far as we can? So think of the driver as the crime scene, and your DRE is your crime tech. If I was called to a homicide, which I wouldn't know a whole lot to do with homicides, that's not my deal, but the first thing I would probably do is roll out some tape around as big of an area as I can get and sit back and wait for the crime lab to show up. Like, we need some experts to come in, gather the evidence. Same type of thing. We just have a crime scene that is not a static location. It's a person. It's maybe the vehicle as well, but the DRE is your crime scene tech. Get them to come in there, gather all the evidence that we need, and they're going to document the specifics of that impairment. And again, that's the key. Officers on the roadside, and I'm not saying we need a DRE in every case. There's plenty of cases that make it through adjudication. We get guilty verdicts, et cetera, without DRE involvement, but the DRE is going to have specific observations. So when they come in, they say, well, I had this prescription and that's my defense to this, et cetera. I'm like, well, that's a central nervous system depressant. Your signs and symptoms or central nervous system stimulant didn't look anything like that. It wasn't that drug. It was something else. And let's see what else is in that blood or urine sample. So we can talk about different things about different drugs. So it's not just, if it's there, that must have been what was causing that impairment. So again, presence does not mean impairment. And a lot of times officers I've talked to over the years have kind of had that mentality, and we've tried to change that. And I think we've done a great job. And I think most of the officers out there now get that piece. Just because I test hot for something doesn't mean that that was the impairing substance. I won't ask for a show of hands here, but if I were to ask anybody in the room, if we took a test from you right now, blood or urine test, would you come back with something in your system that could potentially be argued as an impairing substance if you were to drive a motor vehicle? And I would bet that a bunch of hands would probably go up, be the prescription, be the over-the-counter, whatever it happens to be. Well, we're not under the influence. Okay? I take a prescription every day that would absolutely be considered an impairing substance, and I'm not under the influence. Really, this is me normal. So, so just because I test hot for it doesn't mean I am under the influence. And again, that's what comes back to the officers on the road, and the DREs can help document those things. So officers, do your SFSTs. That's the big piece. SFSTs were not validated for alcohol, and that's a big message that we need to get out to officers. I've been trying to beat that drum the last couple of years. SFSTs were validated for impairment. Alcohol was just the substance we used to validate that. We couldn't validate SFSTs with methamphetamine. We couldn't validate SFSTs and give people a bunch of Xanax and see what happened. That's unethical, certainly. Alcohol is a legal substance. We can do that. There are states now where marijuana is recreationally legal, and they are doing some research along that line saying, well, can we now start to get people dosed up on marijuana, do the research to see if the results of the SFSTs would change at all for specific for marijuana versus alcohol. And there are some other substances that are out there that we're trying to do, but we certainly can't do it with the illicit substances. Officers find a DRE. If you have to go outside your agency, if you have to go outside your county, even if it's somebody that's a couple of counties away and minimally we can at least get a phone call in there, that's great. If you're officers, if you're not A-RIDE trained, that's a great tool for you to at least start that ball rolling, give you a little bit of information, some things you can look for. Again, look for that impairment beyond those validated clues of the SFSTs. Look for some of those other general indicators. For any of the DREs that might be in the room here or online with us, make sure you do your full evaluation. Defense tactics now are if I as a DRE make a drug impaired driving arrest, but I don't do the evaluation on the backside because I think to myself, well, I was there at the scene, so I don't need to do the deeper investigation. The defense tack is, well, you cared enough to do the very least. And if you had done your full evaluation, it would have shown that my client was not under the influence. So that's the reason you didn't do it. And that's a defense tactic for those DREs that maybe don't complete that full evaluation. And again, influence doesn't necessarily mean they have the psychophysical stuff. We look at that pulse and blood pressure, that internal things, as I mentioned. And This is kind of DRE jargon here. We have a chart of what some of the things that we look for. Don't stick to that. There's certainly impairment, and there's clues that go beyond that. And again, those SFSTs are validated for impairment, not alcohol. And then any prosecutors that you might have contact with or might be with us today, find a DRE. If you don't have one involved in your case on the front end, find one on the back end. Check with your agency or other jurisdictions surrounding you. There's been many times I've been sent cases and said, can you look at this and tell me what you think you got going? Just got an email yesterday on a dextromethorphan case from a prosecutor going, I need some information on this because if I got to go forward with this, I need a little bit more help on figuring out what it is I have here. DRE reconstruction, that's a whole nother thing. I know I was only given 40 minutes, and those that know me think he's not going to be able to say or talk for just 40 minutes. So that's a whole nother couple hours I could give you that I won't give you. But if you're interested in talking about DRE reconstruction after the fact, utilizing a DRE in some of those cases, especially our higher profile ones, we have a fatal, a DRE wasn't available, wasn't at the scene. Can somebody review those reports? Can somebody review those tox reports and see if we can maybe determine if that person was likely under the influence when they were driving their vehicle? And for the prosecutors, when no drugs are found, that's not necessarily panic mode. There are millions of things out there that can screw up people's ability to drive. We have a great lab at the BCA. We have one of the best in the country. And then believe me, I've talked to other folks in other states, and I believe we have one of the best labs in the country for finding that, but they can't look for everything. They look for a couple of hundred things, and if the report comes back where it says no drugs were found, maybe it was number 201 on the list. And if they can't look for it, if they aren't looking for it, there's no way that they're going to report that it was there. So that doesn't mean that no drugs were there. It's just no drugs that we look for are there. So there are some other options. There are ways to try to go beyond maybe what our crime lab does and look for some of that stuff, et cetera. And just to give you just one of the last couple slides here, the training programs here in Minnesota, officers have their standardized field sobriety. That focuses on alcohol and the impairment that we typically see with alcohol. But again, our field sobrieties are not validated for alcohol or validated for impairment. We have a DWI SFST update class that gets officers kind of back up to speed every few years. They can do that for grant shifts. They are required to do that every 5 years. A-RIDE I mentioned, that's advanced. We call it advanced because it talks more about the drug impaired driving stuff, some of those general indicators, and then DRE school, drug evaluation and classification training, that gets them to that expert level as somebody who can point more specifically to some of those drugs that are impairing people's ability to drive. Some of the resources here for you, other than my contact information, some of the things that would help to get a little bit of education about the drug impaired driving program, not only here in Minnesota, but regionally and nationally. Some of the things here, there's a million resources out there. If you want some more, I can certainly give you some more. If you want to find out what drug users are doing, I got a couple of great sites that you can go to, and you can get some report back on what they say these substances do and why they take them and what they feel like. So great information out there. Lots of it for individuals who want to learn a little bit more about drug impaired driving. And then again, thank you so much for the time you spent with us here this morning. My contact information one last time for you. If you have anything beyond today, feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thanks, Lieutenant. I don't think you're off the hook quite yet because we've got some time to try to stump him with questions. So if you're online, you can use the chat feature to send some questions in, and Lisa will notify us if that happens. But I'm sure there are some questions for Lieutenant Morose. We'll be happy to, Linda, help pass the microphone around, and we'll field questions for about 10 minutes or so.
Could you just quickly say what schedule 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 drugs are?
Repeat it only for the people on the phone.
Okay, the question was schedule 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 drugs. So drugs in the United States are not all drugs, but they are put on drug schedules based on accepted medical use in this country, potential for abuse, potential for addiction. So Schedule 1 drugs have no accepted medical use in this country, a high potential for abuse, and a high potential for addiction. Now that's the United States rules. So there are things on Schedule 1, Schedule 2 where we say very, very limited or no medical use that you can go to countries outside of the U.S. and you can find it on a shelf at a pharmacy. So that's our rules, kind of in-house if you want to look at it that way. So 1, no medical use, high potential for abuse and addiction. 2, very limited medical use, a little less higher potential for abuse and addiction. As we go through 3, 4, and 5, less or more medical use, less potential for abuse and addiction. But not everything falls onto a drug schedule. There are thousands and thousands of drugs I referenced earlier. We call them legend drugs in Minnesota. Different states have different names for them. A lot of them use legend drug as their title, but that is prescription medications that are not on drug schedules. And that was part of our loophole that we closed a couple of years ago or a year and a half ago with the intoxicating language part of the statute, that we can now go after individuals who are impaired on things that are not specifically controlled substances. So that certainly helped.
On your one slide, it said in 1995, people, the DWI controlled substance influences on driver's records. Why was it so low in 1990 for only 5 people with DWI?
Good question, and I get that a lot. Why did we only see 5 in 1990? I suspect it's lack of training is probably the biggest piece of that from the law enforcement side, and the colonel referenced it, and certainly for my career as well, starting in the late 1980s and working my freeway career, especially on midnights through most of the 1990s and into the early 2000s. I tell every DRE school, and I experience the same thing. I guarantee you, I tell the students, I guarantee you sometime in the next 9 days, that's how long a DRE school is in the classroom, at some point you're going to go, oh man, I let that one go and I shouldn't have. Yep, I did it. I absolutely did it. Every officer did it. They sit back and think, yep, that guy, that gal, they were impaired. I didn't know what I was looking for, wasn't sure what I was doing, and down the road they went. So you saw that when in the early 90s it was very low. I think prosecution has gotten there. I think judges have gotten there. I think juries are a little bit more aware. Officers are better trained. So it's a collaborative from everything in that process. So I think it's a training thing, not only officers, but all the way through that entire process.
Don, what's the conviction rate against the arrest rate on drugs, straight drugs? Do you have any idea? Are juries learning more about the impairment of drugs? You know, if it was maybe oxy, they might do it, but on some of the other drugs, the prescription drugs, do you see a very good conviction rate against the arrest?
Short answer is yes. I don't have the exact data, but that graph certainly shows that, again, starting with just a handful in the early 90s to the thousands we have now, that's not just arrests, that's convictions. So not only are officers making better arrests, they're building better cases, prosecutors are better at presenting those cases, juries are getting better educated in the courtroom in order to determine if that person was in fact, they met the elements of the law to make that conviction. Is it as good as we want it to be? Certainly not. It never is. But I think that it is getting better, again, not only from the officers, but all the way through the entire criminal justice system.
1982 number on the 2017, that was convictions. On that chart of yours.
Yes, that was on a driver's record. So that means they were either convicted of DWI, controlled substance, drugs, whatever term we want to use, or they had a license revocation because of that. So we call it incidence because we have the civil side and the criminal side. So there was either a sanction or a penalty for DWI drugs for 5 people in 1990 and a couple thousand or almost a couple thousand last year.
Was there, do you have a list of or numbers of arrests as to drug only?
And that's a number, the question, do we have a number of arrests for drug impaired driving over that time? And that is a question that I have been chasing for decades, and there really isn't one good clearinghouse that tells us that. Arrests go into county records, they go into police department records, so short of querying every law enforcement agency and trying to tally those numbers, there is no one clearinghouse. We can't go to the courts and say how many arrests were there. They track convictions, they track charges, et cetera. So, and I wish there was, because that would be a phenomenal number, and that would really show us the extent of the problem that we have.
I've heard anecdotally that the officers that go through DRE training are actually just better overall officers, even outside of traffic enforcement. Is that something that the State Patrol has heard as well, that when officers are asked to assist at, say, a domestic situation, they're able to determine that, okay, somebody here is absolutely impaired or under the influence of a drug?
Are we better? Yep. There's your answer. No, the the DRE school is designed as an impaired driving training program. But I tell those officers that go through that, as well as A-Ride, this is going to help you in every facet of your career. When you go to those loud parties, when you go to those domestics, when you go to those persons in crisis, can we determine what is going on based on those observable signs and symptoms? Absolutely, we can overlay that into all kinds of stuff. The analytical stuff that we go through and the investigation pieces that we go through to become a DRE, that certainly helps officers as well through the rest of their career. Of course, it's designed for impaired driving, but it certainly bleeds over into many other facets of law enforcement.
They raise the confidence level of their partners as well, because they're a resource for them. They learn more. So it's not just them; it expands and we make their departments better too by raising that level of confidence.
Absolutely, thanks, Scott. And another thing I tell officers, and I certainly tell command staff as we're discussing whether to send somebody to DRE school, it's the rock in the pond. You got one, but boy, it is going to spread very quickly, and I've seen that. And I've gotten feedback from sheriffs and chiefs and commanders throughout the years saying, I had one that we trained one DRE and he called me 2 months later and said, I need another one. I'm like, well, Sheriff, I'm not going to have another school for a year, whatever. Can you guarantee me a seat? I'm like, well, it's 10 months away. And he's like, I need one. I'm like, okay. I'm like, well, I don't guarantee seats, but okay, sure. You know, I'm like, holy, and he was pressing me pretty hard. It was 2 months after he had one. He said, I'm running this guy ragged. He's been back 2 months and I'm running him ragged.
Do you see, with regards to while you're gathering evidence during either a stop or when you get into the field sobriety testing, you're looking at several things, including the blurry eyes and the slurred speech and the things that you can see that you might need to explain in a report. Do you see more body camera footage being introduced to the judge and jury just so they can see a firsthand look of what you saw? Absolutely. We stress those officers, not only your squad camera, but your body cam can pick up some of those rigid muscle movements or some of the muscle tone and maybe even the size of their pupils, other things that in the past we've had to just testify about, that their pupils look to be dilated or constricted or inappropriate for the lighting condition that we were in. And now we do have some video evidence. And again, they're not foolproof. I mean, cameras only pick up what they pick up, but any information is great. Absolutely. Yeah, that's more and more being introduced. Yes. Oh, yeah. Are more popular now. Yep. Yeah, more and more evidence is being introduced, and we're stressing to those officers, utilize that, kind of work with your camera, make sure that you can gather that evidence and that your camera is picking that stuff up.
What's the average time between the stop or arrest and the urine or blood draw, and how does that latency of them continuing to metabolize the substances and impact the arrest?
Great question, and much like alcohol, within the alcohol portion of the statute, we say whatever we test within that 2 hours, that's what we're going to determine they were at the time that they were driving. And we live and die by that. If they drop under, then that's what they were, and if they're over, that's what they were, and we have to kind of go with what that is. But many drugs are very short-lived, where I stop them at the roadside, they are bouncing off the walls, tweaking, grinding their teeth, all kinds of stuff. By the time I get them back to the police department, maybe an hour later, or if a DRE is involved, maybe a little longer than that before we get a sample from them. The outward signs aren't necessarily there. So that's, again, why we stress for the officer at the roadside, you need to document those specific things that you're going to see. I, as a DRE, am going to document the things I see, which might be completely different. And then between the two of us and the results, we can explain that away. For example, a real case example, and you don't need stories from me, but officer told me this guy's bouncing off the walls, driving 1,000 miles an hour, grinding his teeth, talking like, nonstop. And by the time I saw him, he was basically curled up on the floor in a holding cell. And the officer was like, I swear to God, I'm like, I believe you. It's been an hour since you called me. By the time I got there and saw this person, I'm like, that's got nothing to do with what you saw on the roadside. I'm going to tell you what I think is going on right now. And then between the two of us, we can kind of get together and see. Some drugs last, 12, 14, 24 hours on some of them. Some of them, crack cocaine, 20 minutes. Those individuals will tell you that 20 minutes after they smoke it, they don't feel high anymore. I will still see some signs. Pupils will be up, blood pressure will be up, pulse will be up, but they will say, I don't feel high. I don't feel high anymore. Some will say 5 to 10 minutes, but 20 is about what I've typically heard. So what they see on the roadside is really needs to be documented well, and then what ends up downstream of that when the test is taken, we kind of put those two things together.
With alcohol, there was a push for officers to then utilize breathalyzers roadside. With the data that we can collect from blood samples and urine samples, is there a push that officers are someday going to have to also be drawing blood on the roadside to be able to prove the impairment faster?
Probably not roadside, but we certainly stress to officers, because some drugs are very short-lived, particularly marijuana. I smoke marijuana within the first 45 minutes, maybe an hour, that THC level. It's probably going to peak while I'm smoking, and then it'll drop quickly after that. Crack cocaine, like I said, in and out pretty fast. So some of those things are pretty short-lived. I don't think that it would be practical to take blood at the roadside, but certainly make that arrest, get that warrant submitted, get the sample as quickly as possible on some of those things. DRE still might get utilized after that, but quicker we get the test, the quicker we certainly get what the impairing substance was at the level that it was at the time they were driving. So short of having that language like we have for alcohol, anything in the 2 hours, we'll call it equal. We're not going to get that kind of language, I don't suspect, for things other than alcohol, because things peak a lot differently. They don't have a real linear peak and absorption and burn off like alcohol does. Some are quick, some are a little longer. So we do train police officers in Minnesota as law enforcement phlebotomists. We've had that program here in Minnesota since 2011. Right now, I think we're at about 90 phlebotomists from about 30 some agencies throughout Minnesota. So we don't have to necessarily take that trip to the hospital. We don't have to make that, burn up that extra time. If we've got that resource, if we've got somebody in our agency or surrounding agency that can meet us right at the sheriff's office or the police department, they won't take a sample at roadside, but they certainly can once they get back to a secure location.
All right. Thanks again, Lieutenant Morose. So again, thanks everybody for coming. Just a few announcements. You'll receive an online survey asking you about today's experience. Please take the survey. It takes less than 2 minutes, and it really helps Linda and the TZD crew and everyone involved to figure out what we should do next and what can be done to improve these opportunities. The next stakeholder breakfast is scheduled for Wednesday, July 22nd, so you might want to mark that down. The 8 TZD regional workshop registrations are open for those events, so check that out on the TZD website and sign up to go to those. It's not too early to mark your calendar for, of course, the annual conference. The 2020 statewide conference is in Duluth this October on the 20th and 21st. Registration will open in late August, but get it on your calendar. In the meantime, watch for the call for presentation email being sent out in mid-February. I can speak as someone who's been part of the conference planning in years past. If you've been somewhere and saw some speaker that you thought was great that would be relevant, put it down. They want feedback, they want assistance, and everyone in this room goes to different conferences and sees different topics from speakers that would be relevant and helpful at our conference. I'd like to encourage you to interact on social media with TZD. Follow Minnesota TZD on Twitter and like us on Facebook. That just doesn't roll off my tongue as a non-social media guy, but I totally get the value of it. So get on Twitter and get on Facebook and go viral, make it go viral with TZD. I don't have any other announcements, but I'd be remiss if I didn't thank the Minnesota Safety Council for hosting us at their facility, and the work Center for Transportation Studies, I believe, sponsors some of the breakfast and things that happen. So the collaborative effort here amongst all the TZD folks is really important and helpful, and your work every single day is critical to this topic and everything else that we talk about at TZD. So I think that covers it. If I missed anything, let me know. You got one more, Lisa, and then we're done.
If you're attending the program meeting, you are going to have to BYOC because we had to move some of the chairs over for this great attendance. So bring your own chair with you when you head over.
And again, thank you to Lieutenant Morose. Appreciate it.